bullshit, you know what I mean? And then all it does is it means everybody else starts phoning.
Did you know that while the world often assumes John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the primary conflicting duo of the Beatles, the one who harbored the deepest resentment was actually George Harrison? From the early years to the end of his life, George never truly escaped Paul's shadow, and he once expressed bitter words about his bandmate. So, what made George Harrison despise Paul McCartney more than anyone else? The story began in Liverpool, where Harrison, still a teenager with a guitar perpetually slung across his shoulder, met Paul McCartney. Their connection was born not in the bright lights of stardom, but in the unassuming hallways of school and the modest backstreets of their hometown. By the age of 15, Harrison had earned a spot in the Quarrymen, the skiffle group that would eventually evolve into the Beatles. For Lennon and McCartney, the group was their creation, their joint experiment. Harrison's role from the beginning was secondary, a talented player brought into their orbit but never entirely part of their shared nucleus. As the Quarrymen sharpened their sound and transitioned into the band that would later conquer the world, Harrison's presence seemed both essential and marginal. His guitar work provided texture and depth, yet the creative spotlight rarely fell on him. Lennon and McCartney were already carving out a partnership that would define the era, a powerhouse songwriting duo that left little room for other voices. George, in effect, became the third wheel, vital for the ride but never trusted with the steering wheel. When the Beatles exploded onto the global stage in the early 1960s, the world was quick to assign labels to each member. Lennon was the rebel philosopher, McCartney the charming romantic, Ringo the affable everyman. And George? He was branded the quiet Beatle. The description stuck, though it only scratched the surface of who he was. Silence, in his case, was not merely a personality trait. It was also a shield, a way to cope with being constantly overshadowed by the creative giant looming on either side of him. Yet silence does not mean contentment. Beneath the calm exterior, Harrison wrestled with a gnawing dissatisfaction. His songwriting ideas were often dismissed before they had a chance to breathe. Songs that he poured his heart into would be vetoed in favor of yet another Lennon-McCartney track. Even his guitar playing, the very craft that secured his place in the band, was subjected to scrutiny and control, particularly from McCartney, whose perfectionism often verged on domination. Harrison would later admit that Paul's constant interventions chipped away at his confidence, making him doubt his own ability on the instrument he loved most. "He ruined me as a guitarist," Harrison once confessed, not with bitterness but with weary honesty. Paul's intent may not have been malicious, but the effect was suffocating. This pattern of contribution met with dismissal shaped Harrison's early years with the Beatles. While fans around the world screamed his name, inside the recording studio, he fought to have his voice heard. In a band built on collaboration, George's experience was one of near-constant exclusion. To the public, he was a Beatle. To himself, he often felt like an intruder in Lennon and McCartney's private club. By the late 1960s, the cracks within the Beatles were no longer hidden beneath the sheen of their success. What had once been subtle slights and quiet frustrations began to erupt into open conflict. The turning point came during the recording sessions for the White Album and later Let It Be. Eras defined not just by groundbreaking music, but also by simmering hostility. George Harrison, long accustomed to biting his tongue, finally let his discontent slip into plain sight. In Michael Lindsay Hogg's documentary, Let It Be, there exists a moment so raw that it has become iconic in the mythology of the band. In front of rolling cameras, George looks across at Paul McCartney, his voice calm but laced with resignation. "I'll play whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." The words were not shouted, nor delivered in anger. They were spoken with the weary detachment of a man who had been pushed too far, cornered by years of creative dismissal. It was the sound of a spirit cracking, and the world witnessed it unfold. Behind the scenes, the tension was even sharper. In early 1969, overwhelmed by the suffocating atmosphere, George walked out of the band entirely. For several days, the Beatles were reduced to 3. Lennon's flippant suggestion was to replace him with Eric Clapton, a remark that may have been half joking but underscored how expendable George sometimes felt in the eyes of his bandmates. Though he returned after negotiations and concessions, the damage was done. His departure, however brief, was a clear warning. George Harrison was no longer willing to play the role of silent subordinate. When the Beatles finally disbanded in 1970, George wasted no time making his feelings known, not in interviews, but in his music. His solo debut, All Things Must Pass, stunned critics and fans alike with its sheer volume and quality of material. Songs that had been quietly bottled up during his years with the Beatles. Hidden among the spiritual anthems and soaring melodies were tracks that carried sharp edges. Wah Wah was more than a guitar-driven jam. It was a cathartic release of pent-up resentment, widely interpreted as a direct jab at McCartney's suffocating control in the studio. Later, Sue Me, Sue You Blues openly mocked the bitter legal disputes that followed the band's breakup, another thinly veiled dig at Paul. While Lennon and McCartney's rivalry often dominated headlines, Harrison's grievances ran just as deep, arguably deeper. His former wife, Pattie Boyd, would later confess that George never really liked Paul's personality. It wasn't mere professional rivalry. It was personal. McCartney's meticulousness, his tendency to micromanage, and his relentless drive to perfect every detail clashed with Harrison's more fluid, spiritual approach to music. The result was years of unspoken animosity that only fully revealed itself once the band dissolved. But George's complicated relationships were not limited to Paul. With John Lennon, the dynamic was equally fraught, though tinged with different shades of pain. In the early years, George had looked up to John, treating him as both mentor and older brother figure. Lennon's sharp humor and rebellious charisma captivated him, shaping the young guitarist's early worldview. Yet admiration turned to alienation. When Harrison began exploring Indian philosophy, Hindu spirituality, and the meditative path that would define much of his later life, Lennon mocked him. What George considered a sacred journey, John often dismissed as naive or eccentric. This dismissal cut deep. Spirituality was not a passing interest for Harrison. It was the core of his identity. To be ridiculed by someone he once idolized was a wound that never fully healed. The silence spoke louder than words. In his autobiography, I, Me, Mine George scarcely mentioned Lennon at all. For a man who chose his words carefully, this omission was deafening. Where others filled pages with memories, George offered almost nothing. A literary absence that revealed more than any criticism could. By the end of the 1960s, Harrison's sense of isolation within the Beatles had crystallized. He was no longer simply the quiet Beatle. He had become the disillusioned Beatle, the resentful Beatle, the one who could not, or would not, pretend everything was fine. His creativity had been stifled, his personal beliefs dismissed, and his relationships strained to the breaking point. And yet, in this crucible of conflict, George Harrison found liberation. His exit from the Beatles was not just the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of an artistic rebirth. The bitterness was real, the scars undeniable, but the freedom it gave him would allow his voice to finally rise above the noise of Lennon and McCartney. By the 1990s, decades after the Beatles' breakup, the four men were no longer the mop-topped icons of the 1960s, but seasoned veterans, each with their own legacies and burdens. Yet even time, it seemed, could not fully heal the fractures that had once divided them. When the surviving members reunited for the ambitious anthology project, fans hoped for a sense of reconciliation, a final chapter of harmony to balance out the acrimony of the past. But for George Harrison, the experience was less a triumphant reunion than a reluctant obligation. Working alongside Paul McCartney once again stirred memories he had long tried to leave behind. To Harrison, it felt like being dragged back into old patterns he had outgrown. It was like going back to school, he quipped, a cutting remark that laid bare his discomfort. What McCartney may have viewed as a nostalgic revival, Harrison experienced as a return to the same classroom dynamics where Paul dictated and George obeyed. Even after all the years, the old hierarchy lingered. Harrison's attitude toward McCartney remained complicated. Their bond was undeniable, forged in adolescence and tested through fame, but mutual affection was always shadowed by resentment. In a rare online chat in 2001, months before his death, a fan posed a direct question. Did Paul still annoy him? George's answer was anything but straightforward. Instead of lashing out or offering a polite dismissal, he responded with a proverb, layered with both wit and resignation. It was philosophical on the surface, yet carried an undercurrent of sarcasm, proof that the sting of their conflicts had never entirely dulled. His words suggested not reconciliation, but acceptance, an acknowledgement that some tensions never truly dissolve. They only soften with time. And yet, even the most fractured relationships can find a measure of grace in the face of mortality. In the final chapter of Harrison's life, as cancer slowly overtook his body, there was one meeting that stood apart. Paul McCartney came to see him privately. Gone were the egos, the rivalries, the debates over chords and credits. In that quiet room, the two men held hands and spoke softly, their shared history compressed into a moment of fragile humanity. Paul would later recall that meeting with a tenderness that surprised many. He referred to George as my little baby brother, a phrase that carried both affection and regret. For all the decades of conflict, Paul still saw the boy he had once brought into a band, the friend he had grown up alongside. But even that poignant encounter has been left open to interpretation. Did it mark true reconciliation, or was it merely a final gesture of civility between two men bound by history but divided by personality? Some close to them believe forgiveness was incomplete, that Harrison never fully relinquished the bitterness that had accumulated over the years. Others argue that in those final moments, words mattered less than the simple act of presence, that two old friends, after a lifetime of turbulence, had finally chosen peace. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Harrison was never one to dwell on sentimentality. His life had long been guided by spiritual philosophies that emphasized detachment, the letting go of earthly grievances. To him, clinging to resentment was as pointless as clinging to fame. And yet, he was also deeply human, wounded by years of being dismissed and overshadowed. His reluctance to openly forgive Paul may not have been stubbornness, but honesty. Some wounds, after all, leave scars too deep to vanish completely. As the world mourned his passing in November 2001, tributes poured in from friends, family, and fellow musicians. Paul's words were especially tender, calling Harrison a lovely guy and a brave man, and reflecting on their last meeting with visible emotion. Ringo Starr, who had been at Harrison's side just weeks before the end, broke down in tears when recalling their final conversation. Even Yoko Ono, often a lightning rod for Beatles fans, spoke of Harrison's kindness and quiet strength. In those final years, George Harrison became something more than the quiet Beatle. He was a man who had walked through fire, creative frustration, personal betrayal, global fame, spiritual searching, and emerged with a wry smile and a guitar in hand. His music in those later decades carried a reflective, almost serene quality, as if he had finally made peace with himself, even if not entirely with others. Songs like Any Road and Pisces Fish revealed a man who had learned to see life not as a battlefield, but as a fleeting journey. And yet, his story remains defined as much by conflict as by harmony. The unresolved tension with Paul McCartney is not a blemish on his legacy, but a reminder of his humanity. Great artists, after all, are not saints. They are flawed, fragile individuals who struggle, resent, forgive, and sometimes refuse to forgive. Harrison's unwillingness to neatly tie up his relationships makes his story all the more real, all the more compelling. In the end, George Harrison left behind a paradoxical legacy, a man known for his silence whose music spoke volumes, a Beatle who often felt like an outsider, yet whose contributions became essential to the band's greatness, a friend who both resisted and cherished the bonds that fame had forged. His final years revealed a man still wrestling with old grievances, yet facing death with courage, humor, and grace. If there was a single thread that ran through George Harrison's life, from his teenage years in Liverpool to his final days in Los Angeles, it was the complicated, often painful bond he shared with Paul McCartney. To the public eye, theirs was a brotherly relationship, two old friends bound together by the miracle of the Beatles. But beneath the polite exchanges and professional courtesies lay a truth that was far less flattering. More than anyone else in his orbit, Paul was the figure who most embodied George's frustrations, disappointments, and lifelong sense of being diminished. Harrison himself rarely used the language of hatred. He was, after all, a man deeply influenced by Eastern philosophy, a seeker who spent much of his life preaching detachment and compassion. Yet, if one were to ask who had caused him the deepest wounds, who had consistently made him feel invisible, there would be little debate. For George, Paul McCartney was both collaborator and captor, the man whose musical brilliance he admired, but whose controlling nature left him feeling suffocated. The roots of this resentment were sown early. In the tight confines of Abbey Road studios, Harrison often watched his songs brushed aside while Paul's compositions were meticulously crafted to perfection. McCartney's relentless pursuit of detail, his insistence on dictating not just the arrangements, but even the nuances of George's guitar parts, left Harrison feeling like an employee rather than an equal partner. "He ruined me as a guitarist," George once remarked, a devastating admission that underscored how deeply Paul's dominance had eroded his confidence. To outsiders, the Beatles were a brotherhood. To Harrison, it often felt more like servitude. This dynamic never truly shifted, even as the years passed. During the anthology sessions in the 1990s, George's caustic remark, that working with Paul felt like going back to school, wasn't just a witty quip. It was a flash of truth. Decades of solo success, spiritual exploration, and personal growth had not erased the memory of those suffocating studio days. McCartney, with his genial smile and tireless work ethic, still represented to George the old order, the classroom monitor, the perfectionist, the self-appointed leader. Friends and family often spoke about the undercurrent of disdain Harrison carried for Paul. Patty Boyd, George's first wife, was blunt. George never really liked Paul's personality. The bitterness wasn't about musical rivalry alone. It was personal. McCartney's charm, the very trait that made him adored by millions, struck Harrison as insincere, even manipulative. To George, Paul was someone who always wanted the spotlight, who needed control, who never truly respected him as an equal. And yet, the paradox was that Harrison could not escape Paul. Even in his solo career, the shadow of McCartney loomed large. Songs like Wah Wah and Sue Me, Sue You Blues carried a venom that was unmistakably aimed at his former bandmate. The public tended to focus on Lennon versus McCartney, the great creative duel of rock history. But Harrison's animosity was more enduring, less theatrical, and perhaps more deeply felt. Lennon could infuriate him, yes, but Paul was the one who had systematically undermined him for years. It was not just a clash of egos. It was a wound that never quite healed. By the 2000s, when Harrison was facing the end of his life, there were gestures of reconciliation. That private meeting where Paul held George's hand, speaking to him softly as his health declined, offered a glimpse of something tender, even brotherly. Paul later described him as "my little baby brother," a line that moved fans to tears. But for those who knew the long history between them, the moment was bittersweet. Did George forgive him in that final hour? Or did he simply accept his presence, too tired to resist, too close to the end to reopen old battles? The truth remains elusive. What is clear is that Harrison never fully shed his resentment. In interviews, his remarks about Paul were always laced with irony, a sideways smile masking years of buried anger. Even his silence spoke volumes. When given opportunities to praise McCartney, George often chose restraint, offering vague pleasantries rather than genuine admiration. He saved his deepest respect for others: Bob Dylan, Ravi Shankar, Eric Clapton, artists who treated him as an equal rather than a subordinate. If there was one person George Harrison could be said to hate more than anyone, it was not because of malice or cruelty, but because of the relentless erosion of his spirit under Paul's dominance. McCartney, in George's eyes, represented both the glory and the prison of the Beatles, the partner who gave him fame beyond measure, and the rival who denied him recognition within it. The story of George Harrison and Paul McCartney is more than a footnote in Beatles history. It is a reminder that even within the most legendary of partnerships, human flaws can cut as deeply as artistic triumphs can inspire. The world may remember Harrison as the quiet Beatle, but behind that quiet exterior was a man wrestling with emotions that were anything but silent. His silence was not weakness. It was the weight of suppressed frustration, of unspoken rivalries, and of wounds that fame could never heal. What makes their story compelling is its duality. On one hand, Paul McCartney and George Harrison created music together that changed the world, songs whose melodies and harmonies continue to echo across generations. On the other hand, their personal relationship was a battlefield of egos, pride, and unhealed scars. Harrison's bitterness toward Paul was not a passing squabble. It was a wound that lingered for decades, surfacing in songs, in interviews, even in his silences. And yet, life has a way of complicating the neat narratives we crave. That final meeting between the two, where Paul held George's hand and spoke to him as a brother, forces us to reconsider. Did George, in his last moments, let go of a lifetime of resentment? Or was the gesture simply Paul's attempt at closure, a way of making peace with his own regrets? We may never know the full truth. The ambiguity is part of what keeps the story alive, part of what makes it resonate with anyone who has ever loved and clashed with those closest to them. In the end, perhaps the lesson is not about whether George forgave Paul, but about the universality of conflict itself. Even the greatest bands, even the most celebrated artists are still human, flawed, vulnerable, and shaped by the same struggles as the rest of us. Their music may be immortal, but their relationships were as fragile as our own. So now, the question turns to you. Do you believe George Harrison ever truly forgave Paul McCartney before he passed away? Was there a quiet reconciliation in those final moments, or did the bitterness remain, unspoken but unresolved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story gave you a new way to see the Beatles beyond the spotlight, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell. There are countless untold stories, hidden conflicts, and fascinating truths in the world of celebrity, and we'll be bringing them all to you. Stay tuned, because sometimes what happens off stage is even more dramatic than the music itself.